Tim Crane begins the mechanical mind by considering in the first chapter the puzzle of representation. He sets out to determine how things come to have representational properties. When working through the book, it helped my understanding massively to consider the first chapter in the light of Plato's Euthyphro, and so in this video I'll explain the similarities and its impact on what Crane is trying to do. Crane aims to discover how representations represent. In Plato's Euthyphro, the question being answered is, how are pious things pious? Plato's Euthyphro is a story in which Socrates is awaiting trial, charged with impiety. By chance, he meets a supposedly wise man, Euthyphro, whom he asks for a definition of piety in order to be clear on what exactly it is with which he is being charged. The conclusion of the ensuing discussion has famously become known as the Euthyphro dilemma, which asks whether things are good because the gods command them, or whether the gods command them because they are good. This conclusion has had a significant effect on something called divine command theory, and if this sounds interesting to you, then you can follow any of the links that have just popped up on the screen. However, for understanding the puzzle of representation, it is not the conclusion that is interesting, but the method used to reach it. The method is essentially to ask, in virtue of what does a thing have a certain property? Unless we find that the answer is contained within the nature of the thing itself, then there must be something more fundamental in virtue of which we ascribe it that property. A good example from the Euthyphro itself is, in virtue of what is a carried bucket carried? This question may seem strange at first, but bear with it. Another way of putting it would be, is the bucket a carried thing because it has the property of carriedness in its nature, or is it a carried thing in virtue of something else? In this instance, it is obviously that the bucket is a carried thing in virtue of its being carried by something, so the fact that something is carrying the bucket is fundamental to it being a carried bucket. Now we can consider how this relates to Crane's investigation into the puzzle of representation. Crane intends to discover what things are fundamentally representational, what things play the role of the person carrying the bucket that makes it a carried thing, but in the context of representations. To be clear, a representation is exactly what it sounds like. It is literally a thing that represents something. A representation can represent something else, for example, a portrait represents a person, but it can also represent itself. For example, this sentence is true is a sentence that represents itself. First, Crane considers pictures as representations. The question here is whether it's a fact of the nature of pictures that they represent things, or that pictures represent things in virtue of something else. Crane considers whether pictures can represent in themselves because they resemble the thing being represented. However, he finds a number of reasons for which this cannot be true. Let us consider. Here we have the Duchess of Cornwall looking at a portrait of herself. Clearly the portrait represents her, and clearly it resembles her. It is also true by the same merit that she resembles the portrait. However, she clearly does not represent the portrait, and so resemblance is not sufficient for representation. Here we have the identical twins known as Jedward. Clearly these two resemble each other, and yet we do not want to say that either one of them is a representation of the other. Again, resemblance is not sufficient for representation. Finally, consider this picture, drawn by a young child, of their family. It seems fair to say that this image does not accurately resemble their family, and yet it does seem to represent them. So we see that resemblance is not necessary for representation. So resemblance fails to account for the representational power of pictures. Crane suggests therefore that they must have their representational properties in virtue of something else. Next, Crane considers words as representations. The question here is whether it is a fact of the nature of words that they represent things, or that words represent things in virtue of something else. Crane considers whether words can represent in themselves because they are established by convention to mean the same thing to each of us. In this way, our use of the word dog comes to represent dogs by its conventional use exactly to refer to dogs. However, Crane contends that this simply explains how a word comes to represent something by conventional use, but still fails to explain the nature of that representation. The next suggestion is that, rather than conventionally representing, words come to be conventionally linked with certain ideas. What then are these ideas that words form a link with? Crane considers mental images, the thought being that the word dog forms a conventional link with the mental image of dogs. Crane argues that this cannot work. My use of the word dog may be linked to a mental image of Wishbone, and your use may be linked to a mental image of Clifford, and yet neither of us mean to refer to Wishbone nor Clifford when we use the word dog, but rather dogs more generally. Even if we could establish a kind of idea with which words consistently form conventional links, words would only have their representational power in virtue of these ideas representing something. So we have failed to account for the representational power of words with reference only to their nature. Crane's suggestion is that for both pictures and words, mental representations are the fundamental something else from which their representational power is derived. Crane's conception of mental representations and his justification thereof is a dominant theme of the rest of the book, and not something that I would do justice to in attempting to sum up now. The important point to keep in mind when reading through the book is that Crane believes that when we ask the question, in virtue of what do mental representations represent, the answer will somehow be, in virtue of their own nature.